The champagne flute shattered against the marble floor, sending crystal fragments across Jessica Chen's designer heels. For a moment, the entire ballroom at Riverside Country Club fell silent, 200 pairs of eyes turning toward the sound. But I wasn't looking at the broken glass. I was watching Jessica's face drain of color as my husband David extended his hand with that calm, professional smile he reserved for difficult clients. "Jessica, wonderful to see you again. I hope you've been enjoying your time at TechFlow. We should discuss those quarterly projections on Monday." The recognition hit her like a freight train. Her mouth opened, then closed, then opened again like a fish gasping for air. This was the moment I had been quietly orchestrating for 6 months, ever since I discovered exactly who had been spreading lies about my marriage, my career, and my worth to anyone who would listen. Jessica Chen, my high school tormentor turned corporate climber, had spent years telling mutual friends that my husband was probably some small-time nobody, that I had clearly settled for mediocrity, that her own husband Brandon was pulling in 7 figures, while mine was likely struggling to make ends meet. She had painted herself as the success story, and me as the cautionary tale. What she didn't know was that David Mitchell, my husband of 3 years, wasn't just successful. He was her boss's boss's boss. The founder and CEO of Mitchell & Associates, the marketing powerhouse that held TechFlow's largest contract. The man who could approve or terminate her entire department with a single phone call. And tonight, at our 15-year Lincoln High School reunion, surrounded by classmates who had watched Jessica humiliate me for 4 years straight, justice was about to be served on a silver platter. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The story actually begins 6 months earlier, on a Tuesday morning in January, when I was scrolling through my phone during my coffee break at work. Maya Thompson, my closest friend from high school, had sent me a screenshot of a Facebook post from our reunion planning group. Jessica Chen had written a lengthy update about how excited she was to attend the reunion, mentioning her, quote, incredibly successful husband in finance, and how they had just purchased their second home in an exclusive Dallas neighborhood. The post itself wasn't what caught my attention. It was Maya's follow-up message that made my blood run cold. "Emma, you should see what Jessica's been saying about you in the private group messages. She's telling people you married some random guy and that you're probably struggling financially. She actually said, and I quote, 'Poor Emma always was destined for mediocrity. I heard her husband can barely keep a job.'" I stared at my phone screen, feeling that familiar knot form in my stomach. Even 15 years later, Jessica Chen still had the power to make me feel like that awkward 17-year-old girl who never quite fit in, who was always just a little too smart, a little too quiet, a little too different for the popular crowd's liking. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't that powerless teenager anymore. I had graduated from the University of Iowa with honors, built a successful career in digital marketing, and married a man who wasn't just kind and brilliant, but who happened to run one of the most respected marketing agencies in Texas. David Mitchell wasn't just successful. He was the kind of successful that made Forbes's quote, 40 under 40 inches lists and spoke at industry conferences around the world. More importantly, he was nothing like the struggling nobody Jessica was describing to our former classmates. That evening, I mentioned the situation to David over dinner at our favorite restaurant in downtown Austin. We were sitting at our usual corner table at Cafe Luna, the one with the perfect view of the city lights, when I showed him Maya's screenshots. David read through them carefully, his expression growing more serious with each message. When he finished, he set down his phone and looked at me with that intense focus that had first attracted me to him years earlier. "Emma, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." I nodded, uncertain where this was heading. "This Jessica person, what company did you say she works for?" "TechFlow Solutions." "Why?" David's eyebrows shot up, and he leaned back in his chair with an expression I had never seen before. It was part surprise, part amusement, and part something that looked almost predatory. "Emma, TechFlow Solutions is one of our biggest clients. We handle their entire digital marketing strategy, social media presence, and brand development. It's a $3 million annual contract." The implications hit me immediately. "You mean you're essentially her boss?" "More than that. I'm the person who signs off on their marketing budget, which includes determining staffing needs for their sales team. If someone in their organization isn't performing well or causing problems for our partnership. He didn't need to finish the sentence. I understood perfectly. David, I would never ask you to do anything to jeopardize someone's job because of high school drama. Of course not. But Emma, you should know that we've actually been having some concerns about TechFlow's account management lately. There have been some professionalism issues, missed deadlines, and questionable client communication strategies. I've been meaning to schedule a review of their team. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about all the years Jessica had made my life miserable, all the ways she had undermined my confidence and made me feel small. In high school, she had been the queen bee, the girl who could make or break your social standing with a single comment or withering look. Jessica Chen had ruled Lincoln High School like her personal kingdom. She was beautiful, popular, and cruel in that particular way that teenage girls perfect, targeting insecurities with surgical precision. I had been her favorite victim, partly because I was smart enough to threaten her academic standing, and partly because I was quiet enough not to fight back effectively. She had made fun of my secondhand clothes, my part-time job at the local library, and my mother's beat-up Honda Civic. She had spread rumors about me, excluded me from parties, and once, memorably, had convinced the entire chemistry class that I had cheated on a test just because I had scored higher than her. The worst part wasn't the individual incidents. It was the way she had made me believe that I deserved the treatment, that there was something fundamentally wrong with me that made me worthy of her contempt. When I graduated and left Cedar Falls for college, I had promised myself that I would never let anyone make me feel that small again. I had worked hard, built a successful career, and created a life I was proud of. But apparently, Jessica Chen still saw me as that awkward teenager she could push around. The next morning, I called Maya and asked her to send me every screenshot she had of Jessica's comments about me. What I discovered was worse than I had imagined. Jessica hadn't just made a few offhand remarks. She had been systematically poisoning our former classmates against me for months. She had created an entire narrative about my supposed failures, describing me as someone who had peaked in high school and then faded into obscurity. According to Jessica's version of events, I had married a loser, struggled to find decent work, and was probably living paycheck to paycheck while pretending to be successful on social media. She had even suggested that my photos from business conferences and client events were probably staged or exaggerated. She's been building this story about herself as the success story, and you as the cautionary tale, Maya explained during our phone call. It's like she needs to put you down to make herself feel better about her own life. What has she been saying about her own situation? Oh, Emma, you should hear her. According to Jessica, her husband Brandon is some kind of financial wizard who's making millions. She talks about their luxury cars, their country club membership, their vacation home. She makes it sound like they're living some kind of fairy tale life. That's when I made a decision that would change everything. I spent the next week quietly investigating Jessica's claims about her own life. It wasn't hard to find information in the age of social media and public records. What I discovered was fascinating. Brandon Chen was indeed in finance, but he was a mid-level analyst at a regional firm, not the high-rolling investment guru Jessica had described. Their house, while nice, was a modest suburban home with a mortgage that was clearly stretching their budget. The luxury cars she posted photos of were leases, and the vacation home turned out to be a timeshare they used twice a year. More importantly, I discovered that Jessica's own career wasn't quite as stellar as she had been portraying. While she did work at TechFlow Solutions, she was struggling to meet her sales targets and had been flagged for several client complaints about poor communication and missed deadlines. But the most interesting discovery came when I mentioned Jessica's name to David's assistant, Sophie Turner, who handled much of the day-to-day communication with TechFlow. "Oh, Jessica Chen," Sophie said, rolling her eyes. "She's been a real problem for us lately. Always missing meetings, submitting reports late, and she has this attitude like she's doing us a favor by working with us." David's been talking about requesting a different point person for the account. That's when the plan started forming in my mind. I began attending networking events where I knew TechFlow employees would be present. I volunteered for industry panels and conferences where I could showcase my expertise in digital marketing. I made sure to be visible, professional, and successful in all the right circles. More importantly, I started documenting every interaction, every missed deadline, and every unprofessional communication that came from Jessica's end of the TechFlow relationship. I wasn't sabotaging her, I was simply paying attention to things that were already happening. By March, David was seriously considering recommending that TechFlow replace Jessica as their primary liaison. The decision had nothing to do with me, and everything to do with her consistently poor performance and attitude. She acts like she's entitled to this contract, David told me one evening, as we reviewed the month's client reports. Yesterday she actually hung up on Sophie when Sophie asked for clarification on a campaign timeline. That's not how you treat a vendor who's bringing in $3 million of business annually. What are you going to do? I'm going to give her one more chance. There's a big presentation next month where she needs to demonstrate that she understands our strategic vision for their brand. If she can't handle that professionally, I'll be recommending to TechFlow's executive team that they find someone else to manage our relationship. The presentation David mentioned was scheduled for April 15th. The reunion was planned for June 22nd. I spent the next 2 months watching Jessica's professional situation deteriorate, while her social media presence became increasingly boastful. The worse things got at work, the more extravagant her posts became about her supposed success and her husband's financial achievements. She posted photos of expensive dinners that were clearly special occasions, not regular indulgences. She shared pictures of designer handbags that a quick reverse image search revealed were borrowed or rented. She even posted about a luxury vacation that turned out to be a work conference her company had paid for. Meanwhile, Maya kept me updated on Jessica's continued commentary about my supposedly mediocre life and struggling marriage. She actually said yesterday that she feels sorry for you, Maya reported during one of our weekly check-ins. She said you probably married the first guy who showed interest because you were getting desperate, and that your social media posts about work events are probably just community college seminars or something. The irony was delicious. While Jessica was constructing elaborate lies about her own success and spreading cruel rumors about mine, she had no idea that her actual boss was sleeping next to me every night. David's April presentation meeting with TechFlow did not go well for Jessica. According to Sophie, who sat in on the call, Jessica had been unprepared, defensive, and had actually accused David's team of setting unrealistic expectations. She basically told David that his standards were too high and that other marketing firms would be more flexible, Sophie reported. David just sat there with that calm smile of his and said, perhaps TechFlow would be happier with a different service provider then. The TechFlow executives had immediately backtracked, promising to address the communication issues and ensure better cooperation going forward. But the damage was done. Jessica's position was now precarious, and everyone knew it. That's when Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I decided it was time to RSVP for the reunion. The invitation had been sitting on my kitchen counter for weeks. I had been unsure about attending, partly because of Jessica's presence, and partly because I had genuinely moved on from high school and didn't feel the need to revisit that chapter of my life. But now, the reunion represented something different. It represented an opportunity for truth, for justice, and for finally setting the record straight about who had actually succeeded and who was living a lie. I called the reunion committee and confirmed my attendance for 2. When they asked about my guest, I simply said, my husband, David Mitchell. Maya was thrilled when I told her I was coming. Emma, this is going to be so good. Jessica has been telling everyone that you probably won't even show up because you're embarrassed about how your life turned out. Well, she's about to discover just how wrong she is about that. The weeks leading up to the reunion were surreal. Jessica's social media activity reached new heights of desperation and bragging. She posted daily updates about her excitement for the reunion, her new dress, her plans to show everyone how successful she had become. Meanwhile, David and I calmly made our own preparations. We booked a suite at the nicest hotel in Cedar Falls, arranged for a car service, and I bought a dress that was elegant, expensive, and unmistakably the outfit of someone who had genuinely succeeded in life. More importantly, David had his final meeting with TechFlow's executive team scheduled for the Monday after the reunion weekend. The agenda included a comprehensive review of the account management structure and communication protocols. Jessica had no idea that her professional fate was hanging in the balance, decided by the man she would meet as my supposedly unsuccessful husband. The night before we left for Iowa, David and I had dinner at home, sharing a bottle of wine and talking about what the next day might bring. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" he asked, reaching across the table to take my hand. "David, I've been ready for this for 15 years. The only difference is that now I have the power to do something about it. Just remember, the best revenge is living well. You don't need to prove anything to these people. I'm not trying to prove anything. I'm just going to let the truth speak for itself." As we drove through the familiar streets of Cedar Falls the next evening, I felt a strange mix of nostalgia and anticipation. The town looked smaller than I remembered, but also more charming. The old Victorian houses, the tree-lined streets, the sense of history and community that I had been so eager to escape as a teenager. David squeezed my hand as we pulled up to Riverside Country Club, the same venue where Jessica had held her elaborate prom party senior year, the one I hadn't been invited to. "Ready?" he asked. I looked at the elegant ballroom entrance, at the classmates streaming in wearing their best clothes and biggest smiles, at the life I had built and the truth I was about to reveal. I've never been more ready for anything in my life. We walked through those doors together, and I knew that by the end of the night, Jessica Chen's carefully constructed narrative about both of our lives would be shattered as completely as that champagne flute would be in a few hours. But first, I wanted to watch her perform. I wanted to see her build her lies up as high as possible before I brought them crashing down. The reunion was about to begin, and justice was finally going to be served. Walking into that ballroom felt like stepping through a time portal. The same crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, casting the same warm golden light that had illuminated my senior prom 8 years earlier. The difference was that this time, I wasn't the nervous girl in a discount dress, hoping nobody would notice how out of place I felt. This time, I belonged here more than anyone else in the room. The reunion committee had outdone themselves with the decorations. Our school colors, navy and gold, draped elegantly across the walls, and large photo displays showcased highlights from our graduating class. I spotted myself in a few of the academic achievement photos, standing awkwardly next to Jessica in several Honor Society pictures. Even then, the camera had captured what I was too naive to recognize at the time: the slight smirk on Jessica's face whenever she stood next to me, like she was already planning her next move to undermine whatever success I might achieve. David looked incredible in his charcoal gray suit, commanding attention without trying. Several of my former classmates had already noticed him, their eyes following us as we made our way to the registration table. He had that effortless confidence that came from years of closing million-dollar deals and managing teams of brilliant people. Next to him, I felt genuinely beautiful in my deep emerald dress, the one that cost more than my entire prom outfit had 15 years ago. Kevin Walsh, our former student body president and current reunion organizer, greeted us at the check-in table with the same enthusiastic smile that had gotten him elected 3 times running. He had aged well, still carrying himself with that natural leadership presence that had made him popular without being cruel. "Emma Rodriguez, I can't believe it's really you. You look absolutely amazing." Kevin's enthusiasm seemed genuine, which was refreshing after months of hearing secondhand reports about Jessica's commentary on my supposed decline. "And this must be your husband, David, right?" David shook Kevin's hand with that firm, confident grip that had closed countless business deals. "David Mitchell. Great to meet you, Kevin. Emma's told me so many wonderful stories about Lincoln High." I almost laughed at that diplomatic phrasing. The stories I had actually told David about high school were decidedly less wonderful, but he was too much of a gentleman to let that show in public. "David Mitchell," Kevin repeated, and I saw a flicker of recognition cross his face. "Wait, Mitchell as in Mitchell and Associates? The marketing firm?" "That's right." Kevin's eyes widened slightly. "Wow, Emma, I had no idea. Your husband's company is legendary in the business world. I actually used some of your case studies in my MBA program." This was exactly the kind of moment I had been hoping for. Word would spread quickly through the reunion that Emma Rodriguez hadn't just married well, she had married exceptionally well. By the time Jessica heard about it, the contrast between reality and her fictional narrative would be impossible to ignore. We made our way into the main ballroom, and I began the delicate work of reintroducing myself to classmates I hadn't seen in over a decade. The conversations followed a predictable pattern. Initial surprise at how polished and confident I appeared, genuine interest in my career in digital marketing, and then visible shock when they met David and realized the scope of his success. Lisa Park, who had been editor of our school newspaper, was particularly gratifying to talk with. She had always been kind to me in high school, one of the few people who seemed to recognize that Jessica's treatment of me was unfair. Emma, I have to tell you, I've been following your career on LinkedIn. The campaigns you've worked on are incredible. And David, I've read about your company in Forbes. You two make quite a power couple. David smiled graciously. Emma's the real talent in this relationship. Her strategic thinking and creative vision have influenced some of our biggest client successes. I felt a warm flush of pride, not just because of the compliment, but because of how naturally David made me look accomplished in front of people who had once dismissed me. This was what partnership looked like: two successful people elevating each other, rather than one person tearing the other down to feel better about themselves. As we continued mingling, I kept one eye on the entrance, waiting for Jessica's inevitable arrival. She had posted on social media that morning about her excitement for the reunion, complete with photos of her getting her hair and makeup done at what she claimed was Dallas's most exclusive salon. The images had shown her in a red dress that was expensive but slightly too tight, with jewelry that sparkled a little too much under the harsh salon lighting. Maya Thompson found us near the bar around 8 o'clock, looking fantastic in a navy blue cocktail dress that complemented her natural beauty perfectly. Maya had always been gorgeous, but she had also always been kind, which made her beauty the type that actually improved with age rather than fading. Emma, you made it! Maya's hug was warm and genuine, the kind of greeting I had missed during my years in high school, when Jessica's influence had made many friendships feel conditional and fragile. Maya, this is my husband David. David, this is Maya, the friend who kept me sane through some very difficult teenage years. David shook Maya's hand warmly. Emma talks about you constantly. I feel like I already know you. All good things, I hope. Maya's smile was radiant, but I caught the meaningful look she gave me. She knew what tonight was really about, and she was here to support whatever happened. Has our guest of honor arrived yet? I asked casually, though we all knew exactly who I was referring to. Not yet, but she's been posting updates all day. Apparently she and Brandon are running late because they had to stop by some charity gala first. Very important people, you know. Maya's tone was perfectly neutral, but her expression said everything about what she thought of Jessica's constant need to manufacture importance. Well, I'm sure she'll make quite an entrance when she gets here. And she did. Jessica Chen swept into the ballroom at 8:30, fashionably late and clearly intending to make an impression. She had indeed had her hair and makeup professionally done, and the red dress was even more dramatic in person. Brandon followed behind her, looking uncomfortable in a suit that was obviously expensive but didn't quite fit his personality. He had always been a nice enough guy in high school, quiet and steady, the type of person who seemed genuinely bewildered by Jessica's need for constant drama and attention. Jessica's entrance strategy was flawless, from a social manipulation standpoint. She positioned herself near the entrance where everyone could see her arrival, spent several minutes greeting the reunion organizers with theatrical enthusiasm, and made sure to laugh loudly enough that conversations across the room would pause to look in her direction. I watched this performance with fascination rather than the old familiar dread. 15 years ago, Jessica's ability to command attention had made me feel invisible and inadequate. Now, with the perspective of an adult who had built genuine success and surrounded herself with people who valued substance over performance, Jessica's show looked exactly like what it was: desperate and slightly sad. She looks good, Maya said diplomatically, though I could hear the reservation in her voice. She looks like she's trying very hard, David observed quietly. That's usually a sign that someone's not as confident as they want to appear. David's insight was sharp as always. Jessica's performance was polished, but there was something frantic underneath it, like she was afraid that if she stopped moving and talking and commanding attention for even a moment, people might notice that there wasn't much substance beneath the surface. Jessica began working the room with practiced efficiency, moving from group to group with Brandon in tow. I could hear fragments of her conversations from across the room, each one following the same basic script. Enthusiastic greetings, updates about her important job and successful husband, carefully crafted questions designed to elicit information about other people's lives that she could later evaluate and potentially criticize. I noticed that she was strategically avoiding our corner of the room, though she had clearly spotted us. Several times I caught her glancing in our direction, her eyes lingering on David with obvious curiosity. She was probably trying to get a read on him, to determine whether he lived up to, or contradicted the narrative she had been spreading about my supposedly disappointing marriage. The irony was delicious. Jessica was probably relieved that David looked successful and attractive, because it meant her stories about my settling for a loser were obviously exaggerated, and she could adjust her narrative accordingly without losing too much credibility. What she couldn't possibly realize was that David's success was so far beyond anything she had imagined that her entire understanding of our relative positions in life was about to be completely inverted. Around 9 o'clock, the reunion organizers called for everyone's attention to begin the official program. Kevin Walsh took the microphone and began the usual ceremony of recognizing classmates who had traveled the farthest, had the most children, and had achieved various forms of success. "We have some truly remarkable achievements to celebrate tonight," Kevin announced, consulting his notes. "Let's give a round of applause to Sarah Martinez, who just completed her residency in pediatric surgery at Johns Hopkins." The applause was enthusiastic and genuine. Sarah had been brilliant in high school, and it was wonderful to see that she had achieved her dreams of becoming a doctor. We also want to recognize Michael Thompson, who started his own sustainable energy company and just landed a contract with the state of California. More applause. Michael had been one of the quieter kids in our class, someone who had focused on his studies while the rest of us were worried about social dynamics. It was gratifying to see that his dedication had paid off in such a meaningful way. Kevin continued through his list, recognizing classmates who had become teachers, started successful businesses, served in the military, and achieved various other forms of success. The atmosphere in the room was warm and celebratory, a genuine appreciation for the diverse paths people had taken since graduation. Then Kevin reached the part of the program I had been anticipating. "Now I want to recognize some of our classmates who have achieved particularly notable success in the business world. We have Emma Rodriguez, who has built an impressive career in digital marketing and brand strategy." The applause was polite but not overwhelming. Most people in the room didn't really understand what digital marketing involved, or why it might be impressive. Emma is here tonight with her husband David Mitchell, who founded Mitchell & Associates, one of the most respected marketing firms in the country. The quality of the applause changed immediately. Several people in the room clearly recognized David's name or his company, and the recognition rippled through the crowd like a wave. I felt a surge of pride, not just for David's success, but for the way it reflected on our partnership. Jessica's reaction was visible even from across the room. Her carefully maintained smile flickered for just a moment, replaced by an expression of confusion and something that might have been concern. She had clearly not expected David to be anyone particularly notable, and Kevin's introduction was forcing her to rapidly recalibrate her understanding of the situation. The formal program continued with a few more recognitions and the traditional memorial for classmates who had passed away. The mood grew more somber during this portion, as we remembered the 3 members of our graduating class who had died too young, victims of accidents, illness, and one tragic suicide that had shaken our entire community. After the formal program ended, people began mingling again with renewed energy. The ice had been broken, old friendships had been reestablished, and the natural sorting that happens at these events began to take place. The popular kids from high school gravitated toward each other, the academic achievers formed their own groups, and the various social circles that had defined our teenage years began to reform, with the addition of spouses and the perspective of adult experience. Jessica made her move around 9:30, approaching our group with Brandon trailing behind her and a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Emma? Oh my goodness, you look absolutely fantastic." Jessica's voice carried that particular tone of false enthusiasm that I remembered so well from high school, the one that suggested she was about to say something cutting disguised as a compliment. "Jessica, it's wonderful to see you." I kept my own tone warm but neutral, neither matching her artificial enthusiasm nor displaying any hostility. "You remember Maya, of course, and this is my husband, David." David stepped forward with that professional charm that had made him so successful in business, extending his hand to Jessica with a smile that was polite, but not particularly warm. "Jessica, pleasure to meet you. Emma's told me so much about you." Jessica's laugh was a little too loud, a little too bright. "Oh, I hope it was all good. Emma and I have such a long history together. We were so close in high school." Maya's eyebrows raised slightly at this revision of history, but she said nothing. David simply nodded politely, giving no indication that he knew exactly how Jessica had treated me during our teenage years. "And this is my husband, Brandon," Jessica continued, practically pushing him forward. "Brandon works in finance. He's done incredibly well for himself." Brandon shook hands with David, looking uncomfortable with Jessica's introduction. "Nice to meet you, David. What line of work are you in?" "I run a marketing consultancy," David replied modestly. "We work with various corporations on brand strategy and digital presence." "Oh, how interesting," Jessica jumped in before Brandon could respond. "What kind of corporations?" "We have a diverse client base. Technology companies, financial services, healthcare organizations, retail chains. Pretty much any business that needs to connect with customers in the digital age." Jessica nodded, as if this was exactly what she had expected to hear. "That sounds like a nice, steady business. Very practical." The condescension in her tone was subtle, but unmistakable. She was positioning David's work as solid, but unspectacular, the kind of small-scale consulting that would provide a comfortable but unremarkable living. "It has its moments," David replied with that same modest tone, giving no indication that his nice, steady business generated millions in annual revenue and employed over 200 people. "Brandon's in high-level financial analysis," Jessica continued, clearly intent on establishing her husband's superiority. "He works with investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars." Brandon looked increasingly uncomfortable with this characterization of his job, but he didn't contradict her. I suspected this was a familiar dynamic in their marriage, Jessica inflating his achievements while he stood by awkwardly, trapped between correcting her and supporting her need to impress people. "That sounds very responsible," David said diplomatically. "Financial analysis is crucial work." "Oh, it is. Brandon's clients depend on his expertise to make major investment decisions. The responsibility is enormous." I watched this exchange with growing amusement. Jessica was so focused on establishing Brandon's importance that she wasn't paying attention to David's responses or picking up on the subtle signs that might have indicated she was talking to someone whose success dwarfed anything she was describing. Maya excused herself to get another drink, giving me a look that clearly said she was struggling not to laugh at Jessica's performance. I didn't blame her. The whole scene had a surreal quality, like watching someone unknowingly insult a disguised celebrity. "What about you, Jessica?" David asked politely. "Emma mentioned that you work for a technology company." "Yes, I'm in corporate sales at TechFlow Solutions." Jessica's chest puffed up with pride. "It's a very demanding position. I manage relationships with our major service providers and handle some of our largest contracts." David nodded with interest. TechFlow Solutions. That name sounds familiar. My heart began to race. This was the moment I had been anticipating for months. The moment when Jessica's carefully constructed narrative would begin to crumble. "We're one of the fastest-growing companies in the Dallas market," Jessica continued proudly. "Very selective about who we work with. We only partner with the most elite service providers." "I'm sure you do," David replied, his tone still perfectly neutral. "What type of services do you typically contract for?" "Oh, everything. Technology consulting, financial services, marketing support. We have very high standards for our vendors." "Marketing support is interesting," David said thoughtfully. "That's obviously my area of expertise. Do you work with local firms, or do you look for partners with national reach?" "We only work with the absolute best," Jessica said confidently. "No small-time local operations." Our marketing partner has to be sophisticated enough to handle enterprise-level campaigns. That makes perfect sense, David agreed. Enterprise marketing is definitely a specialized field. Not every firm has the resources or expertise to handle that level of complexity. Jessica preened at what she interpreted as validation of her company's selectivity and, by extension, her own importance in the decision-making process. Exactly. In my position, I have to evaluate potential partners very carefully. One wrong choice could impact millions of dollars in business. The responsibility must be enormous, David said, echoing Jessica's earlier description of Brandon's work. It really is, but I've developed a good instinct for identifying quality partners. You can usually tell right away whether someone has the sophistication to handle our level of business. I bit the inside of my cheek to keep from smiling. Jessica was so busy establishing her own importance and expertise that she was completely missing the trap she was walking into. I'd love to hear more about your selection process, David said with what appeared to be genuine professional interest. How do you typically evaluate potential marketing partners? Jessica launched into a detailed explanation of TechFlow's supposed vendor evaluation process, describing criteria and standards that I knew for a fact her company didn't actually use. She painted herself as a key decision-maker in the process, someone whose approval was essential for any marketing firm hoping to work with TechFlow. The irony was breathtaking. Jessica was describing herself as David's client's gatekeeper, the person who determined whether firms like his were worthy of TechFlow's business, while speaking to the man who actually held her company's largest contract and could terminate her employment with a single phone call. David listened to her entire presentation with polite attention, asking thoughtful follow-up questions that encouraged her to elaborate on her supposed influence and expertise. To anyone watching from the outside, it looked like a normal conversation between professionals discussing their respective industries. Only I knew that David was giving Jessica enough rope to hang herself with, collecting evidence of her inflated claims and professional misconceptions that would make her upcoming humiliation even more complete. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Amanda Foster, my former AP English teacher who had become something of a mentor during my senior year. Mrs. Foster, as I still thought of her, had aged gracefully, her silver hair styled elegantly and her posture still radiating the quiet authority that had made her such an effective educator. Emma Rodriguez, she said warmly, embracing me with genuine affection. I have followed your career with such pride. Your success in marketing has been wonderful to watch. Mrs. Foster, thank you so much. That means the world coming from you. I turned to include David in the conversation. This is my husband, David. David, this is Dr. Amanda Foster, the teacher who taught me how to think critically and communicate effectively. Any teacher who influenced Emma's development deserves my profound gratitude, David said, shaking her hand with obvious respect. Her strategic thinking and communication skills are extraordinary. Dr. Foster beamed at the compliment. Emma was always special. She had this ability to see through surface appearances to the underlying truth of things. It's a rare gift. Jessica and Brandon had been standing somewhat awkwardly during this exchange, clearly uncertain whether they should stay or excuse themselves. Dr. Foster's attention turned to them with the polite interest of an experienced educator. And you must be some of Emma's other classmates, she said warmly. This is Jessica Chen and her husband Brandon, I said, making the introductions. Jessica, you remember Mrs. Foster. Of course, Jessica said, though I could tell she was struggling to place her. Dr. Foster had taught AP English, which Jessica had not taken, and their interactions during high school had been minimal. Jessica works in corporate sales now, I continued. She was just telling us about her important role in vendor selection at her company. Dr. Foster nodded politely. How interesting. What type of company? TechFlow Solutions, Jessica said proudly. We're a major technology firm in Dallas. Wonderful, Dr. Foster replied. The technology sector has created so many opportunities for young professionals. The conversation continued pleasantly for a few more minutes before Dr. Foster excused herself to mingle with other former students. Her departure left the four of us standing together again, but the dynamic had subtly shifted. Jessica seemed to sense that David was more significant than she had initially realized. Though she clearly didn't understand the full extent of his success, her tone became less condescending and more genuinely curious. David, you mentioned that your firm works with technology companies. Have you had much success in that sector? We've been fortunate, David replied modestly. Technology firms often need help communicating complex concepts to broader audiences. It's challenging work, but very rewarding. I imagine it would be. Do you work with any companies that we might have heard of? David paused as if considering how much to share. Well, I don't usually discuss specific clients at social events, but we've worked with several firms that have become household names. Jessica's interest was clearly piqued, but she seemed uncertain how to ask for more details without appearing overly nosy. The conversation was interrupted again, this time by the arrival of Ryan Brooks, who had been Jessica's boyfriend senior year and was now apparently a successful real estate developer in Phoenix. Ryan's presence shifted the group dynamic immediately, as he and Jessica fell into the comfortable rhythm of people who had once been intimate and were now friendly exes. Jessica Chen, Ryan said with genuine warmth, embracing her in a way that made Brandon look slightly uncomfortable. You look absolutely amazing. Ryan, I can't believe it. You look fantastic, too. Jessica's pleasure at seeing Ryan seemed genuine, lacking the performative quality that characterized most of her interactions. Ryan turned his attention to the rest of the group with the easy confidence of someone who had been genuinely popular in high school for positive reasons, rather than fear or manipulation. Emma Rodriguez, he said with a smile. I remember you. You were always the smartest person in whatever room you were in. That's very kind of you to say, I replied, genuinely touched by the compliment. Ryan had never been cruel to me in high school, though he had been part of Jessica's social circle and had therefore been somewhat off-limits as a potential friend. And you must be Emma's husband, Ryan continued, extending his hand to David. Ryan Brooks. David Mitchell. Great to meet you, Ryan. David runs a marketing firm, Jessica interjected, clearly wanting to maintain control of the conversation. They do work with technology companies. Really? Ryan's interest seemed genuine. I've been looking for someone to help with digital marketing for my real estate business. The online space is becoming so important, but it's not really my expertise. I'd be happy to recommend some firms in the Phoenix area, David offered. What type of properties do you focus on? As Ryan began describing his business, which turned out to be quite successful and sophisticated, I noticed Jessica growing quieter. Ryan's easy confidence and obvious success created an interesting contrast to her own more frantic energy, and I could see her recalibrating her approach to the evening. The group dynamic continued to evolve as other classmates joined and left the conversation. Each new arrival brought a different perspective on our shared history and current achievements, creating a complex social tapestry that reflected how much everyone had changed since graduation. But through it all, I remained focused on Jessica and her growing realization that the evening wasn't unfolding according to her expectations. She had clearly anticipated being the most successful person at the reunion, the one whose achievements would make everyone else feel inadequate by comparison. Instead, she was discovering that her former classmates had achieved remarkable things, and her own accomplishments, while respectable, were not particularly extraordinary in this context. More concerning for Jessica, I suspected, was her growing awareness that David was more significant than she had initially realized, which meant her months of disparaging comments about my marriage were not just cruel but also demonstrably false. The stage was set for the evening's climax, and Jessica had no idea that the worst was yet to come. The evening had reached that magical hour when the initial awkwardness of reunion small talk had dissolved into genuine reconnection. The bar was busier now, conversations had grown more animated, and the careful social masks that everyone had worn during the first hour were beginning to slip away. This was exactly the environment I had been hoping for, when people's true personalities would emerge and Jessica's carefully crafted facade would become harder to maintain. I excused myself to the ladies' room, partly because I actually needed to go, and partly because I wanted to give Jessica an opportunity to interrogate David without my presence. I had learned over the years that people often revealed more about themselves when they thought they were operating without oversight, and I was curious to see how Jessica would handle a one-on-one conversation with my husband. The ladies' room at Riverside Country Club was as elegant as I remembered, all marble surfaces and gold fixtures with lighting that somehow managed to be both flattering and functional. I was touching up my lipstick when Lisa Park entered, looking slightly flushed from the wine and the excitement of seeing old friends. "Emma, I have to tell you something," Lisa said, settling into the chair next to mine at the vanity. "I've been watching Jessica tonight, and she seems really rattled by you and David being here." "Really?" "She seems to be enjoying herself." "Oh, she's putting on a good show, but I know her tells from high school. When Jessica gets nervous, she starts overcompensating. She's been name-dropping and bragging even more than usual tonight." Lisa had always been perceptive, one of the few people in our class who had seen through Jessica's manipulations even when we were teenagers. Her observation confirmed what I had been sensing but hadn't been certain about. "What kind of things has she been saying?" "Well, after you left, she started asking David all sorts of questions about his business. But not in a normal, getting-to-know-you way. More like she was trying to find something to criticize or diminish. This was exactly what I had hoped would happen. Jessica's compulsive need to establish superiority would drive her to probe for weaknesses, which would only make her eventual humiliation more complete." "Did David seem bothered by it?" "Not at all. He was perfectly polite, but I could tell he was evaluating her. You know that look that really successful people get when someone's trying to impress them, but doesn't realize they're out of their league? That's exactly what David looked like." I smiled at Lisa's description. David had indeed mastered the art of appearing interested and engaged, while mentally cataloging someone's pretensions and insecurities. It was a skill that served him well in business negotiations, and apparently it was equally useful at high school reunions. "There's something else," Lisa continued, lowering her voice. "Maya told me about the things Jessica's been saying about you online. Emma, I want you to know that most of us didn't believe any of it. Jessica has always been jealous of you, even back in high school." "Jealous of me?" "Lisa, she was the popular one. She was homecoming queen. She dated the star athletes. She had everything I wanted." "No, Emma, she had everything she thought you wanted. But you had things she couldn't buy or manipulate her way into. You were genuinely smart, not just good at memorizing things. You were kind without expecting anything in return. And you had this quiet confidence that drove her crazy because she couldn't figure out how to destroy it." Lisa's words hit me with unexpected force. I had spent so many years thinking of my high school self as weak and victimized, but maybe there had been strength there that I hadn't recognized at the time. "Jessica built her whole identity around being better than other people," Lisa continued. "But you were always just yourself, and that authenticity was something she couldn't compete with. That's why she worked so hard to make you doubt yourself." We were interrupted by the entrance of two other classmates, Sarah Martinez and Jennifer Wong, both of whom had been part of the academic crowd in high school. They joined us at the vanity, and the conversation shifted to more general reunion observations. "Has anyone else noticed that Jessica seems kind of desperate tonight?" Jennifer asked, applying fresh lip gloss. "She's been working the room like she's running for office." "I noticed that too," Sarah agreed. "And her husband looks miserable. He's barely said a word all evening." "Brandon was always quiet," I said diplomatically. "I think he's just overwhelmed by all the socializing." "Maybe, but there's a difference between quiet and uncomfortable. He looks like he wants to disappear every time Jessica starts talking about their success." This observation was particularly interesting because it suggested that even Jessica's marriage wasn't as perfect as she had been portraying. If her own husband was uncomfortable with her public presentations of their life, it indicated deeper problems in their relationship than just financial exaggeration. When I returned to the main ballroom, I found David engaged in animated conversation with a group that now included Kevin Walsh, Ryan Brooks, and Michael Thompson, the classmate who had started the sustainable energy company. Jessica was hovering at the edge of the group, trying to insert herself into the conversation but clearly struggling to find an opening. "Emma, perfect timing," Kevin said as I approached. We were just talking about sustainable business practices and how marketing firms can help promote environmental responsibility. It's fascinating work, David was saying. Companies are realizing that consumers, especially younger demographics, are making purchasing decisions based on corporate environmental responsibility. That's exactly what we found, Michael agreed enthusiastically. But the challenge is communicating complex environmental data in ways that feel authentic rather than like greenwashing. The key is transparency, David replied. Consumers have become very sophisticated about identifying authentic commitment versus marketing spin. The companies that succeed are the ones willing to be honest about both their achievements and their ongoing challenges. I could see Jessica growing increasingly frustrated as the conversation continued without her input. She clearly wanted to contribute something that would demonstrate her business acumen, but the topic was outside her area of expertise, and the other participants were too engaged with each other to pause for her interruptions. Finally, she found an opening when the conversation shifted to the challenges of scaling sustainable practices across large organizations. That's definitely something we deal with at TechFlow, Jessica interjected. As someone who manages vendor relationships, I have to evaluate partners based on their environmental commitments, not just their capabilities. The statement was reasonable enough, but I could see David's slight pause as he processed what she had said. As TechFlow's actual vendor, he would know exactly what criteria they used for partner evaluation, and environmental responsibility wasn't one of them. That's very progressive of TechFlow, David said diplomatically. Many technology companies are still catching up on sustainability requirements. Oh, we're definitely ahead of the curve, Jessica replied confidently. We won't work with any vendor that doesn't meet our environmental standards. This was a particularly bold lie, considering that David's firm had worked with TechFlow for 3 years without ever being asked about environmental practices. Jessica was clearly making things up as she went along, banking on the assumption that no one in the group would be familiar enough with TechFlow to contradict her. That's impressive, Michael said. What kind of environmental certifications do you require from vendors? Jessica's pause was barely perceptible, but I caught it. She was scrambling to come up with specific requirements that would sound credible without being easily verifiable. We have a comprehensive evaluation matrix, she said finally. Carbon footprint analysis, waste reduction protocols, sustainable supply chain verification. It's quite rigorous. David nodded thoughtfully. Those are exactly the kinds of standards that forward-thinking companies are implementing. It must make vendor selection quite challenging. It does, but it's worth it to maintain our corporate values. We'd rather work with a smaller, more environmentally responsible partner than compromise our principles for convenience. I almost choked on my wine. Jessica was describing David's firm as a smaller partner, while simultaneously claiming that environmental responsibility was more important than convenience. The irony was delicious, considering that TechFlow had chosen Mitchell & Associates precisely because of their size, resources, and proven track record with major corporations. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, with Jessica digging herself deeper into fabrications about TechFlow's supposed environmental leadership and rigorous vendor standards. David listened politely, occasionally asking clarifying questions that seemed genuinely interested but actually highlighted the inconsistencies in her stories. I found myself marveling at his restraint. Most people would have been unable to resist correcting such obvious falsehoods, especially when they had direct knowledge of the truth. But David understood that sometimes the most effective strategy was to let people destroy their own credibility rather than attacking them directly. The group began to break up as people drifted toward the bar or moved to reconnect with other classmates. Jessica and Brandon headed toward the buffet table, leaving David and me alone for the first time in over an hour. Having fun? I asked, slipping my arm through his. It's fascinating, David replied with a slight smile. Your friend Jessica has quite an imagination. What did she say while I was gone? She spent about 15 minutes trying to determine whether my business was successful enough to be worth her attention. She asked about our client base, our revenue, our employee count, our office locations. Very thorough due diligence. And what did you tell her? The truth, just not all of it. I mentioned that we work with several Fortune 500 companies, that we have offices in multiple states, and that we've been fortunate to achieve consistent growth. but I didn't mention specific clients or give her any information that would allow her to connect the dots. How did she react? She seemed relieved, actually. I think she was worried that you had married someone unsuccessful, which would have contradicted her narrative about your poor judgment. Once she determined that I was respectably successful, she relaxed and started positioning herself as someone who could potentially be helpful to my business. Helpful how? She offered to introduce me to decision-makers at technology companies who might need marketing services. She seemed very confident about her ability to open doors for the right kind of consultant. The audacity was breathtaking. Jessica was offering to help David's business by leveraging her supposed influence at companies like TechFlow, not realizing that she was talking to the man who already held TechFlow's largest service contract. Did you express interest in her offer? I told her that I'm always interested in meeting potential clients and that I'd appreciate any introductions she felt comfortable making. And she agreed to help? She seemed very enthusiastic about it. She said she'd be happy to put in a good word for me with her contacts. I shook my head in amazement. Jessica was so committed to maintaining her image as an influential power broker that she was willing to promise introductions she couldn't deliver to a man whose business was already successful beyond her comprehension. The evening was approaching 10 o'clock, and I could see that some classmates were beginning to make their departure preparations. The reunion would continue until midnight, but the crowd would start thinning out over the next hour as people with early flights or long drives headed home. This was the time I had been waiting for, when the remaining attendees would be the most engaged and social, creating the perfect audience for Jessica's inevitable downfall. But first, I wanted to give her one more opportunity to compound her lies and make her humiliation even more complete. Maya appeared at my elbow with perfect timing, as if she had sensed that the evening was approaching its climax. "How are you holding up?" she asked quietly. "Wonderfully. Jessica's been even more helpful than I hoped." Helpful? She's been telling David all about her influence in the technology industry and offering to make introductions for his business. Maya's eyes widened. She doesn't know, does she? Not yet, but she's about to. When? Soon. I want to wait until we have the right audience. This kind of revelation deserves witnesses. As if summoned by our conversation, Jessica appeared beside us with Brandon trailing behind, both carrying fresh drinks from the bar. "Emma, I hope you don't mind, but I've been telling David about some of the amazing people in our professional network. I think there might be some real opportunities for collaboration." "That's very generous of you, Jessica. Well, you know how it is in business. It's all about who you know and who you can connect with the right opportunities. I'm always happy to help fellow Lincoln High graduates succeed." The condescension in her tone was unmistakable. She was positioning herself as the successful alumna who could lift up less fortunate classmates through her influence and connections. "David mentioned that you offered to make some introductions." "Absolutely. I work with some very sophisticated technology companies, and I think David's firm could be a good fit for certain projects. Nothing too complex, of course, but there are always opportunities for boutique consultants who can provide specialized services." Maya's eyebrows shot up at the phrase, boutique consultants, and I could see her struggling not to laugh. Jessica was describing Mitchell & Associates, one of the most successful marketing firms in the country, as a small specialty shop that might be suitable for minor projects. "What kind of projects did you have in mind?" David asked with apparent interest. "Well, at TechFlow, we sometimes need support for smaller campaigns or specialized initiatives. The kind of work that might not be worth our primary vendor's attention, but could be perfect for a smaller firm looking to build their portfolio." I felt a surge of anticipation. Jessica was offering David the opportunity to compete for overflow work from his own company's existing client, positioning herself as the gatekeeper who could approve him for projects that weren't important enough for the primary vendor to handle. "That sounds very interesting," David replied. "Who is your primary vendor currently?" "Mitchell & Associates," Jessica said proudly. "They're one of the top marketing firms in the country. We only work with the absolute best." The moment hung in the air like a crystal chandelier about to fall. Jessica had just praised David's company to David himself, while simultaneously offering him the chance to compete for their leftover projects. Maya's hand went to her mouth, and I could see her shoulders shaking with suppressed laughter. Brandon looked confused, clearly sensing that something significant had just happened, but unable to identify what it was. David's expression remained perfectly neutral, but I caught the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth that indicated he was fighting to maintain his composure. Mitchell and Associates, David repeated thoughtfully. I've heard they do excellent work. Oh, they're fantastic, Jessica gushed, completely oblivious to what she had just revealed. Very professional, very sophisticated. Their CEO is brilliant, apparently. I don't work with him directly, of course, but I hear he's one of the most respected leaders in the industry. That's quite a compliment, David said mildly. Well deserved, I'm sure. We don't partner with just anyone. The relationship has been very successful for both companies. I'm sure it has been. The conversation was interrupted by the return of Kevin Walsh, who had been making rounds to thank people for attending and ensure everyone was enjoying themselves. How's everyone doing over here? Having a good time? Wonderful, Jessica replied enthusiastically. We were just talking business. I was telling David about some potential opportunities at my company. That's great, David. I hope you're getting a chance to network tonight. It's amazing how many successful business people we have in our graduating class. It really is, David agreed. I've been impressed by everyone's achievements. Jessica's done particularly well in the corporate world, Kevin continued. She's become quite the power player in Dallas. Jessica preened at the description, clearly enjoying the recognition of her supposed influence and importance. I've been fortunate, she said with false modesty. Working with high-level vendors and managing major relationships has taught me a lot about business strategy. Speaking of which, Maya interjected with perfect timing, I'd love to hear more about this vendor relationship you mentioned. You work with Mitchell and Associates, right? That's right. They handle our marketing strategy and digital presence. It's a very important partnership. And you manage that relationship directly? Well, I'm one of the key liaisons. There are multiple touch points, of course, but I'm involved in all the major decisions. This was getting better and better. Jessica was now claiming direct involvement in managing the relationship with David's company, positioning herself as someone who had significant influence over their contract. That must be a lot of responsibility, Maya continued. I imagine a firm like Mitchell and Associates has very high expectations for their clients. They do, but we've always exceeded their standards. It's a very collaborative relationship. I'm sure the CEO appreciates working with someone of your caliber. I like to think so. We've built a strong professional rapport over the years. I glanced at David, who was listening to this exchange with the same polite attention he had shown all evening, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes, processing Jessica's claims about their supposed professional relationship and collaborative rapport. The truth was that Jessica had never spoken directly to David in any professional context. All communication between TechFlow and Mitchell and Associates was handled through designated account managers and project coordinators. Jessica's role was limited to providing information and feedback when requested, and even that had been inconsistent and often problematic. But here she was, describing herself as David's collaborative partner and professional equal, someone who had built a strong rapport with the CEO of one of the most successful marketing firms in the country. The stage was finally set for the revelation that would shatter Jessica's carefully constructed facade and expose the depth of her deception to everyone present. All that remained was for David to identify himself, and Jessica's humiliation would be complete. The moment had arrived with perfect symmetry. Jessica stood there glowing with pride, having just finished explaining to the group how she managed the relationship with Mitchell and Associates and maintained a collaborative rapport with their CEO. The irony was so complete, it felt almost scripted, like a scene from a perfectly crafted play, where the villain unknowingly reveals their true nature to the very person they've been deceiving. David looked around the small circle that had formed, taking in the faces of Kevin, Maya, Brandon, and myself. His expression was calm, almost serene, like a man who had been waiting patiently for exactly this moment to arrive. Jessica, he said quietly, his voice carrying just enough authority to make everyone lean in slightly, I appreciate your kind words about Mitchell and Associates. Oh, you're welcome. They really are exceptional to work with. I'm glad to hear that, because I'm David Mitchell. I'm the CEO you've been describing. The silence that followed was profound and complete. Not just the absence of conversation, but the kind of vacuum that occurs when reality suddenly shifts and everyone's brain needs a moment to recalibrate their understanding of what they've just witnessed. Jessica's champagne flute slipped from her fingers, shattering against the marble floor in a crystalline explosion that seemed to echo through the entire ballroom. The sound drew attention from nearby conversations, creating ripples of curiosity that spread outward from our little group. Her face went through a series of expressions in rapid succession: confusion, disbelief, recognition, horror, and finally a kind of desperate calculation as she tried to figure out how to recover from what had just happened. But there was no recovery possible. She had spent months telling people that my husband was a failure, and she had just finished praising him as one of the most successful business leaders in his industry. Jessica's usual eloquence had completely deserted her. She looked around the group as if hoping someone would rescue her from this nightmare, but everyone was staring at her with expressions ranging from shock to barely contained amusement. Brandon's face had gone pale as he realized the implications of what his wife had just done. Unlike Jessica, he seemed to immediately understand that she had not only humiliated herself, but potentially jeopardized her career by lying about her professional relationships to the very person she worked for. Kevin was the first to find his voice. Wait, David, you're saying you're the CEO of the company that Jessica works with? That's correct. Mitchell & Associates has been providing marketing services to TechFlow Solutions for 3 years now. It's one of our larger client relationships. Maya's eyes were sparkling with delight as she watched Jessica's carefully constructed world crumble in real time. Jessica, didn't you just say that you and David have a collaborative professional relationship? That is, Jessica was still struggling to form coherent sentences. David stepped in with the kind of diplomatic grace that had made him so successful in business. I think there may have been some miscommunication about the nature of our professional interaction. Jessica works for one of our valued clients, but we haven't had the opportunity to collaborate directly. It was a masterful response, technically accurate, while being devastating in its implications. David was politely indicating that Jessica had been lying about their professional relationship without directly calling her a liar. The effect was somehow more humiliating than a direct accusation would have been. Actually, David continued with that same diplomatic tone, this gives me a perfect opportunity to address some concerns that have come up recently regarding our TechFlow relationship. Jessica's eyes widened in terror. Whatever was coming next, she could sense that it wasn't going to improve her situation. There have been some communication challenges on the account lately. Missed deadlines, incomplete reports, and what my team has described as a somewhat adversarial attitude toward our service delivery. The group was completely silent now, everyone understanding that they were witnessing something far more significant than typical reunion drama. This was a professional reckoning happening in real time. In fact, David said, reaching into his jacket pocket and withdrawing his phone, I was planning to call a meeting with TechFlow's executive team next week to discuss whether some personnel changes might improve our working relationship. Jessica's face had lost all color. She was staring at David like a deer caught in headlights, finally understanding that her months of poor performance and unprofessional behavior had not gone unnoticed by the people who mattered most. David, I think there might be some misunderstanding, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I've always tried to be professional and cooperative with your team. Have you? David's tone remained perfectly polite, but there was steel underneath it now. Because according to my records, you hung up on my assistant last month when she asked for clarification on a campaign timeline. You've submitted 3 reports late in the past quarter, and you've repeatedly questioned our strategic recommendations in terms that my project managers found hostile rather than constructive. Each item David mentioned was like another nail in Jessica's professional coffin. But more than that, it was a demonstration of how completely she had misunderstood her own position and influence within the business relationship. I was just trying to ensure quality, Jessica said weakly. Quality assurance is important, David agreed, but it needs to be done professionally and collaboratively. Unfortunately, that hasn't been the case recently. Brandon finally found his voice, though he looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. David, I'm sure Jessica didn't mean any disrespect. Sometimes business relationships can get complicated. You're absolutely right, Brandon. Business relationships are complicated, which is why we value partners who can handle that complexity with professionalism and grace. The implication was clear. Jessica had failed to meet those standards, and her continued employment was now in question. Maya, who had been watching this exchange with fascination, decided to add another layer to Jessica's humiliation. Jessica, didn't you mention earlier that you were looking forward to helping David's business by making introductions at technology companies? The reminder of Jessica's earlier offer to help David's boutique consulting firm by leveraging her influence at companies like TechFlow was perfectly timed. It highlighted just how completely she had misunderstood the power dynamics of the situation. I was just trying to be helpful, Jessica said, her voice cracking slightly. That's very kind, David replied. Though I should mention that Mitchell & Associates currently works with most of the major technology firms in Texas, so we're quite well connected in that space already. Kevin was shaking his head in amazement. Jessica, I'm trying to understand. Did you know that David was Emma's husband when you were talking about helping his business? Yes, I knew he was Emma's husband. But you didn't know he was the CEO of the company you work with? No, how could I have known that? Maya jumped in again. Well, you said you had a collaborative relationship with the CEO. Didn't you recognize him? This was perhaps the most damaging question of all, because it exposed the complete fabrication of Jessica's claims about her professional importance. If she had really worked closely with David, she would have recognized him immediately. I may have overstated my level of direct interaction with the executive team, Jessica admitted, her voice barely audible. May have overstated? Kevin repeated. Jessica, you told us you had built a strong professional rapport with the CEO. I was speaking generally about the company relationship. David smiled slightly. Jessica, I want to be fair here. Can you help me understand when you and I have interacted professionally? Because I'm looking through my contacts, and I don't see any record of direct communication between us. It was a devastating question, because it demanded specificity that Jessica couldn't provide. She had been caught in a lie so complete that there was no way to salvage it without admitting to complete fabrication. The interactions were probably through intermediaries. I see. So when you said we had a collaborative rapport, you meant that you had worked with members of my team. Yes, that's what I meant. And when you offered to put in a good word for me with your contacts, you were referring to putting in a good word with yourself. The absurdity of the situation was now fully exposed. Jessica had offered to help David's business by leveraging her influence at her own company, not realizing that David's company already held their largest service contract. Brandon looked like he was experiencing physical pain. Jessica, maybe we should go. That might be a good idea, David agreed diplomatically. It's been illuminating to meet you both. But Jessica wasn't ready to surrender completely. In a last, desperate attempt to salvage something from the wreckage of her credibility, she turned to me with an expression that was part plea and part accusation. Emma, you knew about this the whole time, didn't you? You set this up. I met her gaze steadily. Jessica, I didn't set anything up. You created this situation entirely on your own. But you knew David was my company's vendor. You could have said something. Why would I have said something? You spent months telling our classmates that my husband was probably a failure, and that I had settled for mediocrity. You painted yourself as the success story, and me as the cautionary tale. I thought it might be interesting to let people draw their own conclusions about whose judgment was actually questionable. Maya nodded approvingly. Emma's right, Jessica. You created this narrative about your own success and Emma's failures. Nobody forced you to lie about your professional relationships or make assumptions about David's business. Kevin was still processing the full scope of what had just happened. Jessica, I have to ask, if you didn't actually know David, why did you claim to have a professional relationship with him? I was trying to... I do work with his company, so technically, you're a mid-level employee at one of his clients, Maya interjected. That's not the same thing as having a collaborative rapport with the CEO. David stepped in again, his tone becoming more serious. Jessica, I need to address something else. Earlier tonight, you made several claims about TechFlow's vendor selection criteria and environmental standards that don't align with our actual contract or your company's stated policies. Jessica's eyes darted around the group like a trapped animal. I may have been speaking aspirationally about where the company is heading. Aspirationally? David repeated. You told several people that TechFlow requires extensive environmental certifications from vendors, and that you personally evaluate partners based on their sustainability practices. None of that is accurate. I was describing industry best practices. No, you were describing fictional policies and claiming credit for decisions you don't make. That's concerning from a professional integrity standpoint. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Amanda Foster, who had noticed the broken glass and the tense atmosphere around our group. Is everything all right over here? She asked with the kind of calm authority that made her such an effective educator. Everything's fine, David replied smoothly. Just some interesting revelations about professional relationships. Dr. Foster looked around the group, clearly sensing undercurrents she didn't fully understand, but recognizing that some kind of significant interaction had just taken place. Well, I hope everyone is enjoying the reunion. It's wonderful to see how successful so many of our graduates have become. It really is, David agreed, though success means different things to different people. Some people achieve it through hard work and integrity, others through creative storytelling. Dr. Foster raised an eyebrow at this comment, but didn't pursue it further. Indeed, well, I'll let you get back to your conversation. As she moved away, Jessica made one final attempt to control the narrative. Look, maybe I got a little carried away talking about work tonight. These events can be overwhelming, and sometimes people exaggerate their roles or responsibilities. I'm sure everyone here has embellished a story or two. It was a reasonable attempt at damage control, positioning her lies as minor exaggerations that everyone was guilty of, rather than systematic deception that had professional implications. But Maya wasn't going to let her off that easily. Jessica, you didn't just exaggerate your job responsibilities. You spent months telling people that Emma's husband was probably unsuccessful, and that she had made poor life choices. You positioned yourself as the success story at Emma's expense. That's not what I intended. Maybe not, but that's what you did. And now it turns out that Emma's husband is not only successful, but is actually in a position of authority over your career. How do you think that reflects on your judgment? Kevin was nodding slowly as he processed the full implications of the evening's revelations. Jessica, I have to say this is pretty stunning. You criticized Emma's choices while not even understanding your own professional situation. Brandon finally stepped in, though his voice was strained. I think we've all learned something tonight about making assumptions. Jessica, we should probably head home. That's probably wise, David agreed. Jessica, I'll be in touch with TechFlow's executive team next week to discuss the concerns I mentioned. I'd suggest you prepare for that conversation. The threat was politely delivered, but unmistakable. Jessica's professional future was now in serious jeopardy, and everyone present understood that David held her career in his hands. As Jessica and Brandon began to make their exit, she turned back one final time, her face a mixture of humiliation and desperate calculation. David, I hope tonight's conversation won't affect our professional relationship. I've always tried to do good work for TechFlow. Jessica, I evaluate professional relationships based on performance and integrity, not social interactions. But I do think it's worth examining whether there's been a disconnect between your perception of your role and the reality of your contributions. It was a diplomatic way of saying that her inflated sense of her own importance had been noted and would be factored into future decisions about her employment. As they walked away, I could hear fragments of Brandon's quiet, urgent conversation with his wife. He was clearly trying to help her understand the magnitude of what had just happened. But Jessica seemed to be in a state of shock that made rational discussion difficult. Kevin turned to the remaining group with an expression of amazement. In all my years of organizing events, I've never seen anything quite like that. It was pretty spectacular, Maya agreed. Though I have to say, Jessica brought it entirely on herself. David was checking his phone, presumably making mental notes about the follow-up conversations he would need to have with his team and with TechFlow's leadership. It's always unfortunate when professional relationships become complicated by personal dynamics, but sometimes these situations clarify important issues that need to be addressed. Dr. Foster reappeared at that moment, having witnessed Jessica and Brandon's hasty departure. I couldn't help but notice that your conversation seemed to have some dramatic moments. I hope everything resolved satisfactorily. Very satisfactorily, I replied. Sometimes the truth just needs the right moment to emerge. Indeed. You know, Emma, I've always admired your ability to let situations develop naturally rather than forcing confrontations. It's a sign of wisdom and patience. David smiled at that observation. That's exactly what I love about Emma. She has the confidence to let the truth speak for itself, rather than needing to prove anything to anyone. As the evening wound down, other classmates began to approach our group, having heard fragments of the earlier conversation or witnessed Jessica's dramatic exit. The story spread quickly through the remaining reunion attendees, creating a buzz of conversation and speculation. Ryan Brooks appeared with a drink in hand and a grin on his face. I heard there was some kind of business drama over here. Did I miss something good? Maya filled him in on the highlights, and Ryan's expression shifted from amusement to amazement as he realized the scope of what had transpired. So let me get this straight, Ryan said. Jessica spent the evening bragging about her professional relationship with David, not knowing that David was Emma's husband and her actual boss? That's essentially correct, David confirmed. And she offered to help David's business by making introductions at her own company? Among other things, yes. Ryan shook his head in disbelief. That's either the most ironic thing I've ever heard, or the most perfect example of karma in action. Probably both, I replied. As midnight approached and the reunion began to wind down, I found myself reflecting on the evening's events with a deep sense of satisfaction. Not because I had enjoyed Jessica's humiliation, but because the truth had finally been revealed in a way that was impossible to deny or rationalize. For months, Jessica had been spreading lies about my life and my marriage, creating a narrative that positioned her as successful and me as a failure. She had done this not just out of casual cruelty, but out of a deep-seated need to diminish others in order to feel better about herself. Tonight, that entire narrative had been exposed as fiction, not through any action on my part, but through Jessica's own words and behavior. She had created the situation that led to her downfall by being unable to resist boasting about relationships that didn't exist and influence she didn't possess. David put his arm around my waist as we prepared to leave. Ready to go? More than ready. As we walked through the hotel lobby toward the elevator, I felt lighter than I had in months. The weight of Jessica's lies and the lingering insecurities from high school had been lifted, replaced by a clear understanding of my own worth and the strength of the life I had built. Do you think she'll keep her job? I asked as the elevator doors closed. That depends on how the conversation with TechFlow's leadership goes next week. Her performance issues were already a concern before tonight. This just adds another layer of complexity to the situation. I almost feel sorry for her. Almost. Well, she created this situation entirely through her own choices. I can't be too sympathetic to someone who spent months trying to damage my reputation for no reason other than her own insecurity. David nodded thoughtfully. People who need to diminish others to feel good about themselves usually end up diminishing themselves instead. Jessica learned that lesson tonight in a very public way. Back in our hotel room, I stood at the window looking out over the quiet streets of Cedar Falls. The town that had once felt so small and limiting now seemed peaceful and charming, a place where I could visit without feeling trapped or diminished. Any regrets about tonight? David asked, joining me at the window. None whatsoever. For the first time since high school, I feel like the truth about Jessica and me is finally clear. She's the one who built her identity around putting others down, and I'm the one who quietly built a life worth living. You did more than that. You married exceptionally well. I laughed at his mock arrogance. Yes, I did. And tomorrow, Jessica gets to explain to her husband and her employer how she managed to insult her boss's wife for months without realizing who she was talking about. That should be an interesting conversation. 3 days later, Maya called with an update. TechFlow had quietly reassigned Jessica to a different department, with no client-facing responsibilities. She hadn't been fired, but her career advancement prospects had essentially disappeared overnight. And the best part, Maya continued, is that Jessica posted on Facebook yesterday about learning to be more grateful for the opportunities she has. Very philosophical all of a sudden. People often discover wisdom after they've run out of other options. True. Oh, and Emma? Half the reunion is still talking about Saturday night. You've become something of a legend. Not me, David's the one who handled everything perfectly. You both did. But you're the one who waited patiently for justice, instead of trying to force it. That takes real strength. As I hung up the phone, I realized that Maya was right. The greatest victory hadn't been Jessica's humiliation, but my own growth into someone who could wait for truth to emerge, rather than fighting desperately to prove my worth to people who had never deserved the effort. The reunion had given me more than revenge. It had given me closure, confirmation, and the deep satisfaction that comes from knowing that patience and integrity ultimately triumph over manipulation and lies. And sometimes, when the stars align perfectly, justice serves itself on a silver platter while the perpetrator applauds the very person they've been trying to destroy. The weeks following the reunion unfolded like a masterclass in consequences, each day bringing new revelations about how thoroughly Jessica's world had been upended by her own hubris. I found myself in the unusual position of watching someone's life implode from a distance while simultaneously feeling oddly detached from the drama I had inadvertently orchestrated. The first sign that things were moving quickly came on the Tuesday morning after our return to Austin. David was reviewing his morning emails over coffee when his expression shifted from routine concentration to something approaching satisfaction. TechFlow's CEO just requested an emergency meeting for Thursday, he said, looking up from his laptop. Apparently there are some urgent personnel matters they need to discuss regarding our account management. I paused in my morning routine, setting down my coffee cup with careful precision. That was fast. Corporate embarrassment tends to accelerate decision-making timelines. When a mid-level employee publicly claims to have a collaborative relationship with a vendor's CEO at a social event, it raises questions about judgment, supervision, and professional boundaries. David's tone was matter-of-fact, but I could hear the underlying current of business strategy that had made him so successful. This wasn't personal vengeance, it was professional housekeeping, the kind of swift correction that prevented small problems from becoming larger ones. What do you think they'll do? Honestly, I think Jessica's direct client-facing role is over. The question is whether they'll transfer her internally, or whether this becomes a larger conversation about her overall fit within the organization. That Thursday afternoon, while David was in his meeting with TechFlow's executive team, I found myself thinking about the strange mathematics of justice. For years, I had carried the weight of Jessica's cruelty from high school, the lingering doubt about my own worth that her systematic bullying had planted in my adolescent mind. Then, for months, I had endured her adult version of the same behavior, watching her spread lies about my marriage and my success to anyone who would listen. But in a single evening, all of that accumulated poison had been neutralized, not through any direct action on my part, but through Jessica's own inability to resist inflating her importance and diminishing others. She had created the exact conditions for her own downfall, and I had simply been patient enough to let them unfold naturally. When David returned from his meeting that afternoon, his expression was carefully neutral in the way that meant significant developments had occurred. How did it go? I asked, though his demeanor already suggested the answer. TechFlow is restructuring their account management protocols effective immediately. Jessica will be transitioning to an internal role, focused on data analysis and reporting. No client contact, no vendor relationships, no external communications. That sounds like corporate speak for professional exile. It's actually quite generous, considering the alternatives. They could have terminated her for misrepresenting her authority and relationships with vendors. Instead, they're keeping her employed, but removing her from any position where her judgment could impact business relationships. I felt a complex mix of emotions at this news. Relief that Jessica's ability to spread lies about me had been effectively neutralized. Satisfaction that her inflated claims about her professional importance had been definitively corrected. but also a strange kind of sadness for the person she might have been if she hadn't been so consumed with the need to diminish others. Did they say anything about her claims regarding your relationship? The CEO was actually quite diplomatic about it. He said that sometimes employees misunderstand the scope of their roles and the nature of vendor relationships, and that this was a good opportunity to clarify expectations and boundaries. Very political. Very smart. They're treating this as a learning experience rather than a disciplinary action, which protects everyone's reputation while still addressing the problem. That evening, Maya called with updates from the Cedar Falls Gossip Network, which had apparently been buzzing with reunion aftermath for the entire week. Emma, you're not going to believe this, but Jessica has basically disappeared from social media. No posts since Saturday night, no responses to comments, nothing. Her last post was that picture of her getting ready for the reunion. Maybe she's just taking a break from online activity. Maybe, but Sarah Martinez saw her at the grocery store yesterday, and she said Jessica looked like she hadn't slept in days. Very different from the confident woman who swept into the reunion last weekend. I found myself feeling genuinely sympathetic at this description. Whatever Jessica's faults, the complete public exposure of her lies and pretensions must have been genuinely traumatic, especially when it came with immediate professional consequences. Has anyone heard from Brandon? Lisa ran into him at the coffee shop on Monday. She said he was polite but seemed really embarrassed about the whole situation. Apparently, he apologized for Jessica's behavior at the reunion and said they were working through some things. This was perhaps the most concerning development, because it suggested that Jessica's professional humiliation was also creating problems in her marriage. Brandon had always seemed like a decent person who had gotten caught up in Jessica's need for drama and status, and I hoped their relationship could survive her recent revelations. 2 weeks after the reunion, I received an unexpected phone call that would provide another layer of complexity to the situation. I was at my desk reviewing campaign analytics when my assistant buzzed through with a call. Emma, there's someone named Brandon Chen online too. He says it's personal. I felt my stomach tighten as I accepted the call. Brandon and I had never spoken privately, and I couldn't imagine what would prompt him to reach out now. Brandon, this is unexpected. How are you doing? Emma, I hope you don't mind me calling. I got your number from Maya Thompson. I wanted to talk to you about what happened at the reunion. His voice was strained, carrying the weight of someone who had been dealing with difficult conversations for weeks. Of course. What's on your mind? I need to apologize for Jessica's behavior, both at the reunion and over the past few months. I had no idea she had been saying those things about you and David. Brandon, you don't need to apologize for Jessica's choices. Actually, I think I do. I've been married to her for 8 years, and I should have recognized what was happening. When she started talking about how unsuccessful your husband probably was, I should have asked how she could possibly know that. When she made all those claims about her work relationships, I should have questioned whether they were accurate. There was a pain in his voice that went beyond embarrassment, suggesting deeper problems in their marriage than just Jessica's recent professional troubles. These situations are complicated, Brandon. It's not always easy to know when someone you love is struggling with insecurity or making poor choices. The thing is, Emma, I think I did know on some level. Jessica has always had this need to compare herself to other people, to establish hierarchies where she comes out on top. I told myself it was just competitive drive, but what happened at the reunion made me realize it was something more destructive than that. I found myself in the strange position of providing marriage counseling to the husband of my former tormentor, but Brandon's genuine distress was impossible to ignore. Have you talked to Jessica about all this? I've tried. She's been in denial about the severity of what happened. She keeps saying it was just a misunderstanding, that people are making too big a deal out of it. But Emma, she lost her client-facing role at work. That's not a misunderstanding, that's a consequence. How is she handling the job situation? Not well. She's angry at TechFlow for what she calls overreacting. She's angry at David for not being more understanding about her mistake. She's angry at you for not warning her who David was. She's angry at everyone except herself. This pattern was unfortunately familiar from my teenage years with Jessica. When confronted with the consequences of her behavior, She had always found ways to blame external circumstances rather than examining her own choices. Brandon, I need to ask you something, and please know that I'm asking with genuine concern, not judgment. Are you okay? This can't be easy for you personally. There was a long pause before he answered, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter. Honestly, I'm questioning a lot of things right now. This situation has made me realize that I've been enabling Jessica's behavior for years by not calling it out or by making excuses for it. And I'm starting to wonder if that's been fair to either of us. Marriage is complicated. People grow and change, and sometimes that creates challenges that require professional help or difficult conversations. We're actually starting couples counseling next week. Jessica wasn't enthusiastic about it, but I made it clear that our marriage depends on her willingness to examine why she needs to diminish other people to feel good about herself. I was impressed by Brandon's clarity and his willingness to address the underlying issues rather than just trying to smooth over the immediate crisis. That sounds like a wise approach. These patterns often have deep roots, and changing them requires genuine commitment and professional guidance. Emma, can I ask you something? How did you get past what Jessica did to you in high school? Because I'm realizing now that her behavior at the reunion wasn't isolated, that she probably treated you terribly back then too. The question caught me off guard, partly because it forced me to articulate something I had never really examined systematically. I think the key was realizing that Jessica's treatment of me said more about her than it did about me. When someone consistently needs to put others down, it's usually because they're struggling with their own sense of worth. That doesn't excuse the behavior, but it helps you not internalize it as truth about yourself. That makes sense. I think Jessica's been struggling with feeling worthless for a long time, and instead of addressing that directly, she's been trying to solve it by making other people seem less successful or happy. It's a common pattern, but it's ultimately self-defeating because it prevents you from building genuine confidence or meaningful relationships. We talked for another 10 minutes, with Brandon asking thoughtful questions about healing from psychological manipulation and rebuilding self-worth after years of subtle undermining. It was clear that he was not only dealing with Jessica's recent professional crisis, but also reassessing their entire relationship dynamic. After we hung up, I found myself thinking about the ripple effects of the reunion confrontation. Jessica's humiliation had been immediate and public, but the longer-term consequences were more complex and far-reaching than I had anticipated. Her marriage was in crisis, her career had been derailed, and her carefully constructed self-image had been shattered. A month after the reunion, I received another unexpected communication, this time in the form of a handwritten letter delivered to my office. The return address was Jessica's, and the envelope was addressed in her distinctive, carefully controlled handwriting. Inside was a 3-page letter that surprised me with its apparent honesty and introspection. Dear Emma, it began, I've started this letter a dozen times over the past month, trying to find the right words to address what happened at the reunion and the months leading up to it. I've finally realized that there are no right words, only honest ones, and honesty has not been my strong suit lately. The letter continued with what appeared to be a genuine apology for her behavior, both recent and historical. She acknowledged that she had spread lies about my marriage out of jealousy and insecurity, and that she had misrepresented her professional relationships out of a desperate need to seem more important than she actually was. I've been in therapy since the reunion, she wrote, trying to understand why I felt so threatened by your success that I needed to invent stories about your failure. What I've learned is that I've been carrying around feelings of inadequacy since high school, and instead of addressing them directly, I've been trying to solve them by diminishing the achievements of people I saw as competition. The most surprising part of the letter was her acknowledgement of the pattern of behavior that had characterized our relationship since adolescence. I need to be honest about high school, too. I was cruel to you not because you did anything wrong, but because you represented everything I was afraid I wasn't. You were genuinely smart without needing to prove it. You were kind without expecting anything in return. You had this quiet confidence that I found threatening because it wasn't based on other people's approval or recognition. She went on to describe how she had spent years trying to recreate that sense of superiority through professional achievement and social status, but that none of it had filled the underlying sense of inadequacy that drove her need to compete. The reunion was a wake-up call in the most humiliating way possible. Not only did I discover that my assumptions about your life were completely wrong, but I also realized that I had been living in a fantasy about my own importance and influence. The professional consequences have been difficult, but the personal reckoning has been necessary. The letter concluded with what seemed like a genuine request for forgiveness, not for reconciliation, but for her own healing process. I don't expect you to forgive me, and I'm not asking for a relationship or even a response to this letter. I just needed you to know that I understand the damage I caused, and that I'm working to become someone who doesn't need to diminish others to feel worthy of respect. I read the letter twice, trying to gauge its sincerity. The tone was different from anything I had ever heard from Jessica, lacking the performative quality that had characterized most of our interactions. It felt like the voice of someone who had been genuinely humbled and was trying to rebuild from the ground up. I showed the letter to David that evening, curious about his perspective on Jessica's apparent transformation. What do you think? Does this sound genuine to you? David read through the letter carefully, his expression thoughtful. It sounds like someone who's been forced to confront some difficult truths about themselves. Whether that translates into lasting change remains to be seen, but the tone is certainly different from the person we met at the reunion. Do you think I should respond? That depends on what you hope to accomplish. If you're looking for closure, you might already have it. If you're hoping to help Jessica with her healing process, a response might be meaningful. If you're worried about reopening old wounds or getting drawn back into drama, silence might be wiser. I ultimately decided to send a brief response, acknowledging her apology and wishing her well in her therapy and personal growth. I kept it short and neutral, offering forgiveness without invitation for further contact. 3 months later, Maya provided another update on Jessica's situation during one of our regular phone calls. I heard from Lisa that Jessica and Brandon are doing better. They're still in counseling, but Brandon seems more optimistic about their marriage. And apparently, Jessica has actually been doing well in her new role at TechFlow. No client contact, but she's reportedly become very good at data analysis. That's encouraging. Sometimes a professional reset can be exactly what someone needs. The really interesting thing is that she's apparently stopped all the social media bragging. Her posts now are mostly about books she's reading or hiking trails she's exploring. Very different energy. People can change, especially when they're forced to confront the consequences of their behavior. True. Oh, and Emma? I think you should know that she's been telling people that the reunion was the best thing that ever happened to her, even though it was also the most humiliating. How so? She said it forced her to stop living in fantasy and start building something real. She's apparently been recommending therapy to everyone who will listen. 6 months after the reunion, I found myself thinking about Jessica's situation while attending a marketing conference in Dallas. The event was being held at a hotel not far from TechFlow's offices, and I briefly considered whether I might run into her accidentally. As it turned out, I didn't need to wonder long. During the lunch break on the second day of the conference, I was walking through the hotel lobby when I spotted a familiar figure sitting alone at a small table near the windows, reading a book while eating a salad. Jessica looked different from the woman who had swept into the reunion 6 months earlier. Her clothes were still professional but less flashy. Her makeup more subtle. Her overall demeanor calmer and more grounded. She seemed genuinely absorbed in her book, oblivious to the business networking happening around her. I debated whether to approach her, ultimately deciding that avoiding her would be more awkward than a brief, polite interaction. I walked over to her table and waited for her to notice me. When she looked up and saw me, her expression went through a quick succession of emotions: surprise, embarrassment, and then something that looked like relief. "Emma," she said quietly, closing her book and gesturing to the empty chair across from her. "Would you like to sit down?" I accepted the invitation, settling into the chair and noting that Jessica seemed genuinely nervous rather than performatively dramatic. "How are you doing, Jessica?" "Better than I was 6 months ago. Different than I was 6 months ago." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "I got your response to my letter. Thank you for that." "You're welcome. Maya mentioned that you and Brandon are working things out." "We are. It's been hard work, but good work. Therapy has helped me understand a lot of things about myself that I had been avoiding for years." We talked for about 15 minutes, and I was struck by how different Jessica seemed, from every previous version of herself I had encountered. Gone was the desperate need to impress or the compulsive urge to establish superiority. In its place was something that looked like genuine humility and self-awareness. Can I ask you something, Emma? Of course. Do you think people can really change? Or do you think we just get better at managing our worst impulses? It was a surprisingly profound question, and I found myself considering it seriously. I think change is possible, but it requires genuine commitment to understanding why you behave the way you do, and then doing the difficult work of building new patterns. Most people aren't willing to do that level of self-examination. That's what my therapist says. She talks about the difference between surface changes and structural changes. Surface changes are about modifying behavior to avoid consequences. Structural changes are about addressing the underlying beliefs and insecurities that drive the behavior in the first place. Which kind of change are you working on? Structural, I hope. It's harder and slower, but I'm tired of being the kind of person who needs to diminish others to feel good about herself. As our conversation was winding down, Jessica asked one more question that surprised me with its directness. Emma, do you think you'll ever be able to trust that my changes are genuine? Or will you always see me as the person who was cruel to you in high school and dishonest about you as an adult? I considered this question carefully, recognizing that my answer mattered not just for Jessica's sense of redemption, but for my own ability to truly move beyond the past. I think trust has to be earned through consistent behavior over time. But I also think it's possible for people to genuinely transform themselves if they're willing to do the work. You seem to be doing the work. Thank you for that. It means more than you might realize. As I walked back to the conference, I reflected on how the reunion had created outcomes I never could have anticipated. Jessica's humiliation had been immediate and satisfying, but the longer-term consequences had been more complex and potentially more meaningful. She had been forced to confront the emptiness of her fabricated self-image and begin building something more authentic in its place. A year after the reunion, David and I attended the wedding of one of his colleagues in Austin. During the cocktail hour, I struck up a conversation with another guest who mentioned working in Dallas for a technology company. Oh, which one? I asked, making polite conversation. TechFlow Solutions. I'm in their analytics department. That's interesting. I think my husband's firm does work with TechFlow. Mitchell & Associates, yes, they're fantastic. Very professional organization. Do you know someone named Jessica Chen? I believe she works there too. Jessica, yes, she's in our department now. Really sharp analyst, very thorough with data interpretation. She's been a great addition to the team. I felt a surprising sense of satisfaction at this description, evidence that Jessica had found a way to rebuild her professional reputation through competence rather than pretension. She seems to have found her niche. Definitely, and she's one of the most humble people in the office, which is refreshing in the corporate world. Never brags about her achievements or tries to take credit for other people's work. The conversation moved on to other topics, but I found myself thinking about Jessica's apparent transformation throughout the rest of the evening. The woman being described by her colleague bore little resemblance to the person who had made my teenage years miserable, or who had spent months spreading lies about my marriage. That night, as David and I were getting ready for bed, I told him about the conversation with Jessica's colleague. It sounds like she really has changed, David observed. Professional humility is not something you can fake long-term, especially in a corporate environment. Do you think what happened at the reunion was necessary for that change to occur? Probably. Sometimes people need a complete breakdown of their false self-image before they can build something authentic. Jessica's public humiliation was traumatic, but it also forced her to confront truths about herself that she had been avoiding for years. So in a weird way, we did her a favor by letting her expose herself. I think Jessica did herself a favor by creating the conditions for her own reckoning. We just provided the stage. 2 years after the reunion, I received one final communication from Jessica, this time a wedding invitation. She and Brandon were renewing their vows in a small ceremony to celebrate what she described as rebuilding our marriage on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The invitation included a handwritten note. Emma, I know this might seem strange, but your presence at our vow renewal would mean a great deal to me. You've been an unwilling but important part of my journey toward becoming a better person, and I'd like you to witness this new beginning if you're comfortable doing so. David and I discussed the invitation over dinner, weighing the potential awkwardness against the symbolic significance of attending. What does your gut tell you? David asked. That this might be a chance to complete the circle, to demonstrate that forgiveness and transformation are both possible. Then we should go. The ceremony was held in a small garden venue outside Dallas, with about 30 guests in attendance. Jessica looked radiant in a simple ivory dress, but more importantly, she looked genuinely happy in a way that seemed grounded in reality rather than performance. During the reception, she approached me with Brandon, both of them looking nervous but determined. Emma, David, thank you so much for coming. It means everything to have you here. Congratulations to both of you, I replied sincerely. You both look genuinely happy. We are, Brandon said, his relief evident. It's been a long journey, but we're in a much better place now. Jessica told me that your reunion confrontation was a turning point for both of you, I said to Brandon. That takes courage to admit. It was the wake-up call we both needed. Jessica needed to stop competing with everyone around her, and I needed to stop enabling that behavior by staying silent. As the evening progressed, I watched Jessica interact with other guests and was struck by how different her social presence had become. She was warm and engaged without being performative, interested in other people's stories without needing to top them with her own achievements. During a quiet moment, she approached me one last time. Emma, I know I've thanked you before, but I need to say it again. The reunion was the most humiliating experience of my life, but it was also the moment I finally understood that I had been living as someone I didn't actually like or respect. What do you mean? I realized that night that I had built my entire identity around being better than other people, which meant I was constantly threatened by anyone who seemed successful or happy. That's no way to live. What's different now? Now I'm trying to build my identity around being someone I can respect, regardless of how I compare to anyone else. It's harder in some ways, because you can't measure progress as easily, but it's also more sustainable. As David and I drove back to Austin that evening, I found myself reflecting on the unexpected arc of my relationship with Jessica Chen. We had begun as teenagers in a dynamic of cruelty and victimization, evolved into adults where she continued the pattern through lies and manipulation, reached a crisis point at the reunion where her behavior finally caught up with her, and ended as two people who had both learned important lessons about authenticity, forgiveness, and personal growth. Do you think she's really changed permanently? David asked as we navigated the highway back home. I think she's changed enough to recognize when she's falling back into old patterns, and that's probably the most realistic form of lasting change. That's very wise. I learned something important too, you know. What's that? That the best revenge really is living well, but not in the way people usually mean it. It's not about achieving success to spite your enemies. It's about becoming so secure in your own worth that you don't need enemies anymore. 3 years after the reunion, I found myself thinking about Jessica one final time while cleaning out old files in my home office. I came across the original letter she had sent me after the reunion, along with my brief response and the wedding invitation from their vow renewal. Reading through these documents again, I was struck by the complete transformation they represented, not just of Jessica, but of my own relationship to the hurt and anger I had carried from our shared past. The teenage girl who had been systematically bullied by Jessica Chen had grown into a woman who could watch her tormentor's public humiliation with satisfaction, but without cruelty. The adult who had endured months of lies and manipulation had found the patience to let truth emerge naturally, rather than forcing a confrontation. And the person who had every reason to hold grudges had discovered the freedom that comes from genuine forgiveness. Jessica's journey from cruel teenager to insecure adult to humbled but authentic person had been painful and public, but it had also been real. She had faced the consequences of her behavior, done the work to understand its roots, and rebuilt herself into someone capable of genuine relationships and honest self-reflection. My own journey had been quieter but equally significant. I had learned to trust my own worth regardless of external validation, to respond to cruelty with patience rather than retaliation, and to recognize that sometimes the greatest victories are the ones that transform everyone involved, rather than simply defeating an enemy. The reunion had delivered perfect justice in the moment, with Jessica's lies exposed and her pretensions shattered in front of everyone who mattered. But the real success had been the longer process of growth and healing that followed, turning a story of conflict into one of redemption and transformation. As I filed away the letters and invitations, I realized that I rarely thought about Jessica anymore, except with a distant kind of goodwill. She had become part of my past in the healthiest possible way, a chapter that had taught me important lessons but no longer defined my present or limited my future. The bullied teenager and the scheming adult had both found peace, not through victory or defeat, but through the patient work of becoming people worthy of their own respect. And sometimes, that's the most satisfying ending of all. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.